The Young and the Restless spoilers. The collapse of Kyle Abbott's carefully cultivated image reached its most shocking and irreversible point in a moment of despair and uncontrollable rage, forever altering the trajectory of his life and that of everyone around him. For months, the strain between Kyle and Claire Newman had been escalating, a relationship once filled with promise and tender visions of a shared future now poisoned by lies, manipulation, and outside interference. Kyle, who once dreamed of building a marriage with Claire, who imagined her not only as his partner but as a stepmother to Harrison, stood helpless as the illusion of love shattered before his eyes. The moment of truth came not in a quiet conversation or a private farewell but in a brutal, public revelation that left him broken. Seeing Claire, the woman he had risked everything for, wrapped in Holden Novak's embrace, kissing him with a passion and certainty that should have belonged to him, destroyed what little control Kyle still possessed. For all his faults and betrayals, Kyle had convinced himself that Claire was his redemption, his chance to rewrite the story of his life after countless failures. To realize she had chosen someone else, and not just anyone but a rival who had undermined him from the very beginning, was more than his heart could bear. The kiss was not just an act of intimacy, it was the death sentence of the Claire relationship. Claire's lips on Holden's, her whispered promises and tender expressions of devotion, were daggers to Kyle's soul. He had envisioned proposing to her again, had imagined wedding vows, had told himself that with time, she would forgive him for his mistakes with Audra Charles. Instead, he found himself in the cruelest role of all, the outsider, the man cast aside, watching as the woman he loved pledged herself to another. The humiliation was compounded by Holden's smugness, his constant provocation, his taunts that echoed louder than the thudding of Kyle's racing heart. Holden's words, calling him a failure, claiming he was the true object of Claire's love, were the final spark that lit a fire already raging inside Kyle. In that moment, reason fled. What emerged was not the Kyle Abbott groomed in wealth and privilege, but a man consumed by primal rage and despair. The knife, hidden until then, was suddenly in his hand, gleaming under the cruel light of betrayal. He lunged forward with a ferocity that shocked even himself, his hand driven by a torrent of emotions too powerful to restrain. The blade pierced flesh, and Holden's triumphant smirk transformed into horror as blood poured from the wound. The sound of Claire's scream split the air, her voice filled with disbelief and terror as Holden crumpled into her arms. In an instant, the scene shifted from romantic betrayal to violent tragedy, the floor painted with blood and the future of 3 lives forever altered. Claire's reaction was one of devastation. Holding Holden against her chest, she wept uncontrollably, her tears mingling with the crimson spreading across his shirt. The promises they had whispered moments before now seemed cruelly fragile, threatened by the violence that erupted from a man she once thought she could love. For Claire, this was the final confirmation that Kyle had not only lost his way but had become someone unrecognizable, a man driven to such desperate lengths that he would rather destroy than accept rejection. Her heart shattered not just for Holden, whose life now hung in the balance, but for the realization that her attempt to escape cycles of control and betrayal had only pulled her into another storm of destruction. Panic swept through the scene as bystanders rushed to call 911, their frantic voices cutting through the chaos. Every second stretched into eternity as they pressed towels against Holden's wound, praying that the blood would stop, that the young man's shallow breaths would stabilize. Sirens wailed in the distance, a chilling reminder that Genoa City's most shocking scandal was about to burst wide open. For the Abbott family, the shame of Kyle's act would ripple through their legacy, dragging them into headlines not for business triumphs or family drama but for attempted murder. For the Newmans, Claire's suffering would once again expose the vulnerabilities of a woman still trying to find her place in the world. And for Harrison, though shielded for now, the shadow of his father's choices would one day fall heavy on his shoulders. Kyle, standing amidst the chaos, was a man unmoored. The weight of what he had done settled slowly, crushing him under the realization that there was no path back to who he once was. His tears, which had flowed moments earlier as he watched Claire kiss Holden, now became the desperate sobs of a man who had crossed an unforgivable line. No amount of money, no contract, No hollow promises of devotion could erase the image of his hand driving a blade into another man's chest. His dream of marriage to Claire, already fragile, was obliterated. His future as Harrison's role model was tainted. His place in Genoa City, already precarious, was now irreparably marred. The fallout from this act promises to shake every corner of Genoa City. Legally, Kyle faces charges that could strip him of everything: his freedom, his reputation, his role as a father. Emotionally, he has severed any hope of reconciliation with Claire, who will forever remember not the man who once made her laugh or comforted her but the man who, in a fit of rage, nearly killed the one she had chosen instead. For Holden, the question of survival looms. If he recovers, his position will only strengthen, his story one of near martyrdom that will rally sympathy and cement him as the man who endured violence for love. If he does not, Kyle will carry the weight of blood on his hands, an act that no family name, no amount of influence, could ever fully wash away. Victor Newman, who has manipulated much of this from the shadows, may seize upon the chaos to tighten his grip on both Kyle and Claire, bending their shattered states to his will. Audra Charles, ever the opportunist, may twist the scandal to her advantage either by aligning with Kyle in his darkest hour or using his weakness to climb further in power. And the rest of Genoa City will watch, horrified, as the once princely Abbott heir is dragged into infamy, his name forever associated with violence, betrayal, and ruin. At its core, this tragedy is not simply about one violent act but about the destructive force of unchecked desperation. Kyle's love for Claire, once genuine, was twisted into obsession, and when confronted with the sight of her loving another, he allowed rage to eclipse reason. Claire's desire for independence, for a chance to explore life beyond the suffocating control of others, inadvertently drew her into the path of two men whose rivalry turned deadly. Holden's arrogance, his deliberate provocation, played its part as well, fanning the flames of Kyle's insecurities until they erupted in bloodshed. Each choice, each flaw, each whispered taunt and broken promise converged into one horrific act that will haunt them all forever. The future of this storyline will hinge not on whether Kyle regrets his actions, he already does, but on how Genoa City chooses to respond. Will the Abbotts rally around him, seeking to protect their own even as the evidence mounts? Will Claire testify against him, sealing his fate while nursing her grief over Holden's injuries? Will Holden survive to confront his attacker, to gloat or to forgive, depending on the path the writers choose? And perhaps most importantly, what will become of Harrison, whose innocent world will eventually be pierced by the truth that his father's love, once a shield, became a weapon? In the end, the image of Kyle Abbott lunging forward with a knife, his tears blinding him as blood spilled across the floor, will stand as one of the most haunting moments in The Young and the Restless. It is a turning point not only for Kyle but for the entire canvas of characters connected to him. Love, betrayal, jealousy, and rage have always driven Genoa City's most compelling stories, but rarely have they collided with such devastating force. Whatever comes next, one thing is certain: nothing will ever be the same again. The sirens wailed through the night air like the cry of fate itself, drawing closer and closer until their piercing echoes filled the silence that had fallen after Kyle's violent outburst. Blood still stained the floor where Holden Novak had collapsed, his breath shallow, his face pale, his life hanging in the fragile balance between this world and the next. Claire Newman held him tightly, sobbing uncontrollably, her voice breaking with each desperate plea that he stay alive. When the police finally stormed the scene, the chaos became almost unbearable. Paramedics rushed to Holden's side, lifting his limp body onto a stretcher as the metallic smell of blood clung to the air. The sight of the ambulance doors slamming shut, racing toward the hospital with its flashing lights cutting through the darkness, was seared into everyone's memory. But while Holden was being rushed into surgery, Kyle Abbott faced a far different fate. Officers swarmed him, their commands sharp and unyielding, and within moments, the man who once carried the Abbott name with pride and privilege found his wrists locked in cold steel handcuffs. The reality of his actions hit him in waves as he stood there restrained, his face streaked with tears, his chest heaving with regret and anger. Kyle had always been accustomed to control, to influence, to having his name open doors others could only dream of. Yet in this moment, none of it mattered. His cries of sorrow, his pleas that he had acted in a moment of rage, fell on deaf ears. To the police, he was not an Abbott heir, not a grieving lover, he was an assailant, a man who had driven a blade into another human being. His humiliation was total as the onlookers whispered, their eyes wide with shock, their voices carrying words like murderer, coward, monster. Every ounce of pride he had left was stripped away as he was marched out in handcuffs. The image of Claire cradling Holden burned into his mind as the final proof that the love he had once fought for was dead and gone. For Claire, the ordeal solidified every fear she had harbored about Kyle's descent into obsession. She had loved him once, truly and deeply, but the man who had promised her devotion had been replaced by someone reckless, dangerous, and unrecognizable. As she watched him being taken away, her tears hardened into rage. To her, Kyle had not simply betrayed their love, he had violated it in the worst way imaginable by striking down the man who had stepped into her life at the exact moment she needed support. In her mind, Kyle had revealed his true self, not a man of honor or romance, but one of jealousy, violence, and desperation. The whispers of onlookers only fed her fury, confirming what her heart already knew. Kyle's love had never been about her happiness but about his control. As she swore aloud through trembling lips, her grief gave way to vengeance. She would make Kyle pay for what he had done. If Holden died, she would carry his memory like a weapon, a justification for her hatred. If Holden lived, her loyalty to him would only deepen, and she would dedicate herself to ensuring that Kyle suffered for every ounce of blood that had been spilled. Kyle's tears were a reflection of both guilt and disbelief. In the quiet corners of his mind, he could not reconcile the man he had become with the man he once imagined himself to be. He had dreamed of marrying Claire, of building a family with her, of watching Harrison grow up surrounded by love. Now, every piece of that dream lay shattered. His son would one day learn of the night his father lost control, of the moment jealousy and despair transformed him into something unrecognizable. The shame cut deeper than any prison sentence ever could, for Kyle knew he had not only lost Claire but had forever tainted Harrison's image of him as a father. No amount of tears could erase the sight of Holden's blood on his hands, nor could any apology repair the betrayal etched across Claire's tear-stained face. His love for her, once so consuming, had turned into the very force that destroyed them both. The Abbotts, already weary from decades of scandals and betrayals, now faced one of their darkest hours. Jack Abbott, who had fought his whole life to preserve his family's legacy, could only watch in horror as his son was led away in handcuffs. For Jack, the pain was twofold, the fear of losing Kyle to the legal system and the realization that his son had failed to embody the values he had tried so hard to instill. Ashley and Billy would be forced to confront the fallout as well, each carrying their own guilt for not seeing the storm brewing sooner. The Abbott name, once a symbol of innovation and power in Genoa City, now risked being permanently stained by Kyle's act of violence. At the hospital, Holden's fate remained uncertain. Surgeons worked tirelessly to stop the bleeding, their faces grim as they fought against time. Claire refused to leave his side, pacing the waiting room with her heart racing, every second without news feeling like an eternity. Her grief twisted into anger, anger into resolve, until she finally found clarity. She would never forgive Kyle. Not in this life, not in the next. If Holden survived, she would stand by him, offering him the love and loyalty Kyle had thrown away. If Holden died, her grief would turn into a mission of vengeance, ensuring that Kyle's name was forever synonymous with pain and betrayal. The vow she made in those agonizing hours was not a fleeting outburst but a solemn promise. She would see Kyle punished, even if it meant destroying him completely. Back at the police station, Kyle sat alone in a cold cell, his hands trembling as he replayed the moment over and over in his mind. He saw Claire's kiss with Holden, heard Holden's taunts, felt the overwhelming surge of jealousy that blinded him, and then, the moment of impact. The sound of the blade meeting flesh echoed like a curse he could not silence. He sobbed quietly, the weight of his actions pressing down until he could barely breathe. Yet even in his sorrow, a part of him clung to the belief that Claire had betrayed him, that she had used him and discarded him for someone else. It was easier to believe in her treachery than to face the reality that he alone was responsible for the chaos. His love for her had twisted into bitterness, and though his tears spoke of regret, his heart still ached with the belief that she had wronged him first. The lines between love and hate had blurred beyond recognition, and Genoa City now found itself gripped by a scandal that would not soon be forgotten. For Claire and Kyle, their story was no longer one of romance but of tragedy, a descent from promise into ruin. The world would debate endlessly who bore the greater blame, Kyle for his violence, Holden for his arrogance, Claire for her choices, but the truth was that all three had been caught in a cycle of passion and betrayal that had spiraled out of control. The only certainty was that the lives they once knew were gone forever, replaced by a future defined by courtroom battles, hospital vigils, and vows of vengeance whispered through broken hearts. Claire's oath to see Kyle suffer, even to kill him if Holden died, marked the darkest chapter yet. It was not the vow of a scorned lover but the declaration of a woman pushed past her breaking point, her grief and fury sharpening into a blade of their own. For Kyle, the greatest tragedy was that his love, once the brightest light of his life, had become the very force that condemned him. And as the night gave way to dawn, Genoa City braced itself for the reckoning that was to come, a reckoning born of blood, betrayal, and the kind of love that destroys everything it touches.